Forgetting someone's name feels small, but it reveals more about your mind than you realize. Most people assume it is just bad memory or a lack of attention, but that is not always the full explanation. Names are actually one of the hardest types of information for the brain to retain. Not because they are complex, but because they lack meaning. When you hear a name for the first time, it often has no strong connection to anything familiar, which makes it harder for the brain to store. Unlike faces, emotions, or stories, names do not carry immediate significance, so they are more likely to be forgotten. But there is more happening beneath the surface than just memory. Attention plays a major role in whether a name is remembered or not. In many situations, when someone introduces themselves, the focus is not fully on the name. The mind is often occupied with something else, like making a good impression, thinking about what to say next, or analyzing the interaction in real time. This split attention weakens how strongly the name is stored. The brain prioritizes what feels important in the moment, and often, the social interaction itself feels more important than the name attached to it. This is why people can remember how someone made them feel, what they were wearing, or what was said, but still forget their name seconds later. Another factor is cognitive load. When the mind is already processing a lot of information, it becomes harder to retain new details. Social situations are full of stimuli, body language, tone, expressions, environment, and internal thoughts all happening at once. This creates pressure on memory, and smaller details like names are often the first to be dropped. This does not mean someone is not intelligent. In many cases, it means the brain is prioritizing deeper processing over surface-level details. People who think more analytically or observe more deeply may actually be more likely to forget names, because their focus is directed toward understanding rather than memorizing. There is also an emotional layer to this. The brain is far more likely to remember information that is tied to emotion. Names connected to strong experiences become easier to recall, while neutral interactions make names easier to forget. If the moment feels meaningful, surprising, or emotionally engaging, the brain marks it as important. But if the interaction feels routine or expected, the brain does not assign the same priority. This is why repetition becomes important. Hearing a name once is rarely enough for it to stay, especially if there is no emotional or meaningful context attached to it. Another reason people forget names easily is because of how the brain categorizes people. Instead of storing someone as a name, the mind often stores them as a role or impression. The person from work, the person from the gym, the person from that conversation. Over time, this label replaces the name, making the actual name harder to retrieve. The brain values efficiency, and labels are easier to recall than abstract identifiers like names. There is also a deeper psychological element linked to pressure. In social situations, especially first impressions, the mind is often focused on performing well, being liked, or avoiding awkwardness. This creates internal pressure, and that pressure shifts attention away from memory and coding. The name is heard, but it is not processed deeply. It passes through awareness without being stored properly. And because it was never fully encoded, it becomes difficult to recall later. This is why people often remember names after hearing them again in a more relaxed environment. When the pressure is lower, the brain has more capacity to process and retain information. There is also the effect of delayed attention. Sometimes the brain realizes after the introduction that it did not fully register the name, but by that point, it feels too late to ask again. This creates a gap that continues throughout the interaction. The person continues engaging, but without the name, which reinforces the idea that the name was not necessary in that moment. Over time, this pattern becomes familiar. The brain becomes used to letting names pass through without storing them, especially if there are no immediate consequences. Another important factor is repetition and reinforcement. Names that are repeated during a conversation are far more likely to be remembered. But in many interactions, names are only mentioned once at the beginning. Without reinforcement, the brain treats the information as temporary. It does not move from short-term awareness into longer-term memory. This is why names often feel familiar but cannot be recalled when needed. The brain recognizes them but cannot retrieve them clearly. Interest also plays a role. The brain naturally prioritizes what feels relevant or engaging. If there is genuine interest in the person or the conversation, the likelihood of remembering their name increases. But if the interaction feels routine or lacks depth, the brain does not assign strong importance to the name. This is not intentional. It is simply how attention and memory work together. There is also a common misconception that forgetting names reflects care or respect, but that is not always true. Someone can be fully engaged, listening carefully, and understanding everything being said, while still forgetting the name. This is because remembering names relies on a specific type of memory processing that is separate from general attention. In many cases, forgetting a name is not about disinterest, but about how information was processed in that moment. Over time, this creates a pattern that feels automatic. The brain becomes efficient at focusing on meaning, emotion, and understanding, while letting small identifiers, like names, fade. But there is another layer that is often overlooked. The brain is designed to filter out what it considers unnecessary. It does this constantly, without conscious awareness. Names, especially unfamiliar ones, often fall into that category unless they are reinforced or made meaningful. This filtering process helps reduce overload, but it also means certain details are lost quickly. There is also the role of association. The brain remembers information more easily when it is connected to something else. Names without associations are isolated, and isolated information is harder to retain. When a name is linked to a visual detail, a personality trait, or a unique characteristic, it becomes easier to remember. Without that link, it remains abstract and harder to access later. Another factor is retrieval, not just storage. Sometimes the name is actually stored, but the brain struggles to access it at the right moment. This creates the familiar feeling of knowing that you know the name, but not being able to recall it. This is not a failure of memory, but a delay in retrieval. The information exists, but it is not immediately accessible. And the more pressure there is to remember it, the harder it becomes to retrieve. Over time, all of these factors combine into a consistent pattern. Names are heard, but not fully processed. They are stored weakly, or not at all. They are not reinforced, and they are rarely associated with something meaningful. And because of this, they are easily forgotten. But once you understand how this works, it becomes easier to change. Because remembering names is not about having a better memory. It is about changing how information is processed. It is about attention, repetition, association, and intention. When the brain is directed to treat a name as important, it begins to store it differently. When it is repeated, it becomes reinforced. When it is connected to something meaningful, it becomes easier to retrieve. And that is the difference. It is not about trying harder, but about processing differently. Because the mind does not remember everything equally. It remembers what stands out, what repeats, and what feels important in the moment. And once you understand that, forgetting names stops feeling random and starts to feel predictable.